Thank you.
You know, for better than a decade now, defense planners have been wrestling with the challenge of what's called the asymmetric threat. And this is the kind of threat that bin Laden employed in setting us back on our heels in 9/11. And I submit to you that there is not enough money in the U.S. Treasury to protect this country against the full spectrum of possible asymmetric threats. And I think that what is really needed is an asymmetric counter that gets at the ideas behind the guns. And this is made all the more complicated by the fact that religion is such a significant factor in this mix. As we look at Iraq and Afghanistan, it's been quite clear that we have very little ability as a nation state to deal with religious differences in a hostile setting. Nor do we have any ability to counter demagogues like bin Laden, who manipulate religion for their own purposes. Among the reasons for this supreme irony that one of the most religious nations on the face of the earth is so incapable of dealing with the religious imperatives that permeate today's geopolitical landscape, two stand out. First is the fact that we have let our separation of church and state serve as a crutch for not doing our homework and understanding how religion informs the worldviews and political aspirations of those who don't similarly separate the two. And second is our long-held commitment to the rational actor model of decision-making, in which religion was deemed to be irrational and therefore outside the policymaker's calculus. So to some extent, I'm talking about putting religion back in the equation, going full circle, much like religion itself, where the Salvation Army picks a poor gent up out of the gutter. The Baptists wash him off. The Presbyterians organize him. The Methodists educate him. The Anglicans introduce him to high society. And the Salvation Army picks him up out of the gutter. But more seriously, though, this looming specter of religious extremism married to weapons of mass destruction just adds to the urgency for our need to bridge this gap. And one approach that has shown unusual promise at getting at the ideas behind the guns is a new form of engagement called faith-based diplomacy. Simply put, it means incorporating religious considerations into the practice of international politics. Even more simply put, it means making religion part of the solution in some of these intractable identity-based conflicts that exceed the grasp of traditional diplomacy. If you would like to learn more about it, there is a book that came out in 2003 called Faith-Based Diplomacy, Trumping Realpolitik. Oxford University Press put that out, and it was the sequel to the book that Graham mentioned, Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft. And collectively, these two books explore the positive role that religious or spiritual factors can play in actually preventing and resolving conflict while advancing social justice based on reconciliation. I looked out at the book table out there, and this book is on there, the first one, but the second one apparently is sold out, and it's coming out in paperback in May, but we have some back at the center if any of you are interested. This is the Faith-Based Diplomacy book. I'd be happy to send you a copy. But since our inception, some 8.5 years ago, our center, the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, has been practicing faith-based diplomacy in different parts of the world. Sudan, Kashmir, Pakistan, Iran, Syria, the United States, and most recently Afghanistan. And I'd like to tell you about our experiences in just a few of these areas to illustrate how this business of faith-based diplomacy works. First, Sudan. May I have the first slide, please? When we were invited to come into Sudan, we looked hard at it and saw that there were any number of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that were working there, but for the most part they were all focused in the south, dealing with the symptoms of the problem, trying to bring relief to the great suffering that was taking place as a result of the conflict. We, on the other hand, took a different approach. We decided to try to get at the source. So we went to the north, to Khartoum, and set out to deliberately establish relationships of trust with the Islamic regime. And from that standpoint, try to encourage them to take steps toward peace that they wouldn't otherwise take. And we were about a year and a half into that process when we had a watershed moment in November of 2000, when we brought some 30 religious leaders and scholars together in Khartoum to discuss the religious aspects of the conflict and to make some recommendations. The most challenging aspect was getting the Christian religious leaders to participate, because of this 30, 10 were prominent Sudanese Christian religious leaders, 10 were prominent Sudanese Muslim religious leaders, and 10 were internationals from both faith communities. And the reason scholars were included along with the leaders was because Islam is so decentralized that the imam in any given mosque has a very limited reach, and it's really the scholars that have the much broader sweep. But the Christians were just afraid this was going to be another PR bonanza for the government, because the government of Sudan over the previous 10 years had mounted no fewer than 3 major interreligious dialogue conferences involving lots of people from lots of nations. But nowhere along the line were the Christian leaders of Sudan given an opportunity to air their grievances. When they attempted to do so, they were drowned out. So one could understand their skepticism. But after long spirited discussions with them, they came around. I told them, first, there will be no PR. And I said, second, you really have no choice. As a Christian, you're called to be a peacemaker, and this is about making peace. So they came with their heels dragging. And at the end of the first day, they came up to me with smiles on their faces, and they said, this is the first time we have ever been heard. And by the third day, you had very prominent Sudanese participants voicing the need to address some of the problems they were hearing about. And when it was all over, an elder statesman, also Islamic, a Muslim, told me 2 things. He said, first, this is the first time in the history of our country that Northerners and Southerners have spoken together from the heart. The second thing he said was that he had never before, in his limited experience, which wasn't all that limited, he'd been a diplomat all his life and he was quite old, but he'd never before seen such a single concentration of intellectual horsepower as existed in that meeting on the Muslim side. And this was not by accident. It was very much by design, because we weren't there to overthrow the regime. We weren't there to abolish Sharia or Islamic law. We were there merely to answer a simple question. What steps can an Islamic government take to alleviate the second-class status of non-Muslims in a Sharia context? And if we could come up with credible answers to that question and had highly credible Muslims around the table, then this might resonate in other parts of the world like Nigeria and Indonesia, where similar kinds of tensions exist. Well, when it was all over, there was a genuine breakthrough in communications between the 2 communities. What started out in frosty silence ended up with joking and a degree of camaraderie. And 17 consensus recommendations emerged. I'll talk about one of those in a minute. But one has to ask oneself, why did this meeting succeed when the wounds ran so deep? And I submit part of the reason is because it was an exercise in faith-based diplomacy. We began each day with readings from the Bible and the Quran. We preceded each day with a prayer breakfast at the hotel for the internationals and local religious leaders. More to the point, we brought a prayer team to Khartoum from Santa Barbara, California, halfway around the world, whose sole purpose was to pray and fast during those 4 days, praying for the success of deliberations. So as the 4 days unwound, you'd see these folks coming in from the side very quietly, determining what needed praying for, and then praying. And when my vice president for training, who was the Episcopal rector in California, called me with the idea and asked what I thought about it, bringing a prayer team. I said, well, I think it makes all the sense in the world. I can't believe that people who pray 5 times daily are going to get upset if we bring a prayer team. Well, all of these things caused collectively, of course, each day we took a prayer break for the Muslims as well, and all of this caused people to rise above themselves. And although the Christians bared their grievances just as baldly as one could hope, it was all done in a cordial tone, and it made all the difference. Another part of the faith-based diplomacy leading up to this was in my numerous conversations with the Sudanese foreign minister and first vice president. These were realpolitik kinds of discussions, trying to persuade them what we were suggesting was in their own best interest to do. But looking for that helpful opportunity to make a reference to the Quran or how the Prophet Muhammad dealt with such a situation, or what Jesus might have to say about it. And when you integrate that, I have never yet seen a Muslim, no matter how hard-boiled or tough-minded they may be, who doesn't open up, because this is what they like to think they're all about. And many Muslims feel very uncomfortable, if not resentful, of having to deal with secular constructs. And this is part of, why we've been speaking past one another for about 1,000 years. But in terms of the recommendations that emerged, one that I thought was very key was the formation of an interreligious council, which would meet on a monthly basis and bring the top leadership of both the Christian and Muslim faith communities together to surface and resolve their issues, and also to hold the government accountable for its religious policies. The thing that's it took us about 2 years to do that, and it was a matter of getting the right relationships in place. Something that women know from birth and men sometimes figure out is that, all things are relational, and you really need to get that right. So it took us a lot longer than it should have, however, because one of the lessons learned out of this exercise is that when you're trying a top-down strategy, as we were, that you need to pay a lot of attention to the second and third tier decision makers. Because we would be in Sudan. I made some 17 trips to Sudan, and we'd move the ball down the field. Everything looked great, but the instant we left town, it was just frozen. And that was because the second and third tier decision makers felt that what we were doing was ultimately going to be at their expense, benefiting the Christians at the expense of the Muslims. Had we thought this through and focused on them, it was very easy to show that how this was a win-win for everyone. But so they would try to sabotage it when we were gone. And it just took that much longer to make it happen. In the first several months of that council's existence, they had achieved more concrete practical measures benefiting non-Muslims than the churches had been able to do working on their own for the previous 10 years. And that was owing in large part to the leadership, exceptional leadership that we had on the Muslim side. We got someone who had been a pioneer in the Islamic movement in Sudan, but who had been a constant critic of the administration, the Sudanese government, ever since they had seized power in a coup in '89. So that was the wrong way to take power. And so he'd been a constant critic, and it took me 5 months to persuade the regime that he was to be the leader of this independent body. Now, what's remarkable about this is that this is taking place in the context of an Islamic dictatorship, which not only agreed to the formation of this independent body, part of whose mandate was to hold them accountable for their religious policies, but also agreed to leadership that they didn't want. And they also agreed to take seriously the recommendations of this council. And Darfur notwithstanding, which is a Muslim-on-Muslim situation, I'm pleased to say that the government has honored that commitment to the tune of more than $500,000 now in the form of land and funding to support the building of new churches and to provide restitution for the past seizure of church properties. So let me at this point ask for the next slide. This was one of a snapshot from what was taking place at this interreligious meeting that I was talking about. This gent here is Enoch Tombe, who was then the Secretary General of the Sudan Council of Churches, and right there to my right is Hassan al-Turabi, who was thought by most to be the leading force behind the advance of militant Islam across North Africa and beyond. Next slide, please. I'd like to shift now to our work in Pakistan. For about 3.5 years now, we have been on the ground in Pakistan reforming the madrasas, the religious schools, including those that gave rise to the Taliban. Now, these schools have quite an illustrious history. Back in the Middle Ages, they were the absolute peaks of learning excellence in the world at the time. It was only Western exposure to them that led to the creation of our university system. And small things that you don't think about, like funding a chair in a given discipline or the mortar boards and tassels you wear at graduation, they came out of the madrasas. And unfortunately, over time, particularly under the impact of colonialism, they regressed and they tried to divest themselves of all disciplines that could be identified with the West, to the point where the vast majority of them now are about rote memorization of the Quran and the study of Islamic principles. Well, our goals have been twofold. One is to expand those curriculums to include the social and physical sciences, but with a very strong emphasis on human rights, particularly women's rights, and religious tolerance. And second, and more importantly, is to transform the pedagogy to create critical thinking skills among the students. When we first started out, if a student raised his hand in class, he would be punished for disrespect. And what happens is these kids will learn the Quran. I met one young man, 12 years old, cover to cover. He'd memorized it. But unfortunately, they don't really understand what it means. They memorize it in Arabic. Their first language is Urdu, and they're not given near enough Arabic to understand something as sophisticated as the Quran. So along comes the local militant who misappropriates a little scripture, as all religions are prone to do from time to time, to recruit these kids to their cause, and they're just absolutely easy prey. They've got no ability to challenge, no ability to question. Indeed, when I sit down with a madrasa leader and tell him what he's doing and point out how what he's doing is counterproductive to his own best interest, take him through a logic flow to a new conclusion, he can follow that logic flow, he can embrace the new conclusion, but what he's absolutely incapable of doing is starting that thought process himself. And this has to do with tribal traditions and all sorts of things that get in the way. The success we've had contrasts rather dramatically with the past attempts by the government of Pakistan to reform these schools. Indeed, in the wake of 9/11, our government gave Pakistan $100 million for educational reform. And the madrasas just merely thumb their noses at it. They are independently funded, most of them locally. Some get money from the Gulf states. But they're afraid of losing their independence. They're afraid of the possible secularization of their curriculums. So why we have had the success we've had is for two reasons. One, we've been able to do it in such a way that they feel it's their reform effort and not something imposed from the outside. And this means we give them a lot of ownership in the process. Sometimes that it's as simple as showing them good things and they ask for more. But secondly, we inspire them with their own heritage, pointing out how many of the pioneering breakthroughs in the arts and sciences, including religious tolerance, took place under Islam 1,000 years ago. And when they start hearing this and internalizing it, they start walking a little taller and thinking, hey, maybe we can do better. So at this point, may I have the next slide, please? We have affected a little more than 1,000 madrasas, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's maybe as many as 15,000 out there. Not even the government knows how many it is, but somewhere between 12 and 15,000. Those numbers are going to grow substantially in the future because we've been training the more able performers in our workshops how to train themselves, and they go out and they reach other madrasas. Next slide, please. This just shows a group who are proudly showing their completion certificates from our workshops. Now I'd like to tell you a few stories. Everybody loves a good story. But about a year ago, I took two of my, this will illustrate just faith-based diplomacy as well. I took a couple of my board members over and we made presentations in several madrasas that were clearly identified with terrorism. And we had not been in those madrasas before. We were only there because of the credibility that we now had for dealing with other madrasas. And walked into the room, and it's filled with madrasa leaders, administrative oversight board personnel, senior Islamic scholars, and there was a lot of rage in the room. Rage over U.S. foreign policy, and rage over the fact that the Lebanon crisis was at its peak at that time. And anything Israel does, we automatically get credited for. So to work through that rage, I began by saying, look, we're not a government organization, nor have we ever received any money from our government. I said, and while it's clear the U.S. may have made some mistakes of late, it's important for you to recognize when they intervened on behalf of Muslims in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Somalia. I said, left untold in most tellings of Somalia are the more than 100,000 Somali lives that were saved as a result of that humanitarian intervention. And I said, but we're not really here to discuss that. We're here to discuss values that we hold in common. And then I recited several verses from the Quran, which I had committed to memory, but a poor paraphrase of which was, O mankind, God could have made you one had he willed, but he did not. Instead, he made you into separate nations and tribes, that you may get to know one another, cooperate with one another, and compete with one another in good works. And I said, I and my two colleagues here are here to open the competition in good works. Now, we're not a religious organization. We are an organization that deals with religions, and we are multi-religious in our makeup. But these two board members, like I, happen to be Christians. So I told the group, I said, look, I said, the three of us here happen to be followers of Jesus. And we know that you can't be a good Muslim unless you believe some pretty wonderful things about Jesus. So I said, let's ask ourselves, if he were standing right here today, how would he want us to act toward one another? And by the time that conversation played out, that rage had actually been converted to a spirit of fellowship. And this was, this first one that we did this in was a Deobandi madrasa. There are 5 sects that sponsor madrasas in Pakistan. The most hardline are the Wahhabi and the Deobandi, and the most powerful by far is the Deobandi, out of which the Taliban emerged. But this was a Deobandi madrasa down near Karachi that was well known to be the chief supplier of fighters for Chechnya and Kashmir, and also had spawned the 2 most violent anti-Shiite terrorist groups, and that had been proven. We did the same thing with a Wahhabi madrasa up near Lahore that had been identified with the London bombers, and to the same effect. And the madrasa leader of that madrasa was a very big, imposing, and widely revered and somewhat feared individual. And our project director has interacted with him several times since that encounter. And each time he has mentioned the question that I asked, and he says, and it has caused me to ask myself, what would the prophet have me do? So as far as I'm concerned, you know, that justified the whole exercise all in and of itself. Another story. In our first all-Wahhabi workshop, one of the participants was a Taliban commander of some renown. And it was clear he was pretty despondent. He had lost 2 sons in the fighting. He says, we don't know what America wants. And he says, you come after us with guns, we have no recourse. So this then, in turn, I was not there. That was a conversation with our project director, but that led to an invitation for me to come up into the mountains of Pakistan to meet with Taliban commanders, the senior leadership, to tell them what America wants. So I did that, and there were 57 Taliban commanders and religious leaders and tribal leaders. Most of them were from Afghanistan, had come across the mountains for this meeting. And I told them, I said, look, I'm here today to see if we can develop a confidence-building measure that could point toward peace. But for you to be able to participate in this exercise, you need to understand the Western perspective on this situation. And then I proceeded to tell him what America wanted. And I said merely that wants you to distance yourself from al-Qaeda, lay down your arms, and reconcile with the Karzai government. And then a period of discussion took place, out of which about 5 questions emerged. The first question was, well, what do the American people want? You've told us what the government wants. What do the American people want? That gave me some reassurance, by the way. We get cut a lot of slack around the world, as vilified as we are, but people do still tend to distinguish between our government and the people of America. And I said, well, what Americans want is peace in the region with democratically stable governments in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they wanted to know why we were attacking Islam. And I said, we're not. And then I went into the business of intervening, the same rationale I'd used with the madrasas about past interventions on behalf of Muslims. Then they asked, why are you invading Afghanistan? And I said, well, to put it in terms that you hold dear, hospitality, loyalty, and revenge, before we recognized certain members of al-Qaeda as a threat, we welcomed them into our country. We gave them hospitality, and then without warning, they struck. We wanted revenge, so we asked the Taliban government to turn over al-Qaeda's leadership so we could bring them to justice. You refused, so we attacked. I said, but we did so with a heavy heart, because most Americans hold great admiration and respect for the Afghan people stemming from our common struggle against the Soviet Union. And I said, it's also important for you to recognize that now some of your tribal leaders are banding together against al-Qaeda because they violated your hospitality. Then they wanted to know why we were attacking Iraq, and I just sort of said, well, there's exactly. So I said, well, there's a little bit of debate about that, but as far as I was concerned, that too is a matter of revenge, because Saddam Hussein had attempted to assassinate a previous president. Took a little bit of license there, but then the last question was, why are you supporting Israel? I said, well, we have a strategic relationship with Israel. It isn't going to change anytime soon. I said, but what is changing is our understanding of compassion for and support of the Palestinian people. I said, over time, that's going to make a difference. So then we broke for prayer, came back together in a smaller group, and we developed a confidence-building measure. One more little story along those lines. If I could have the next slide, please. This is a picture of our project director, who's a Pakistani-American, spent his youth in Karachi, attended a madrasa, one of the most able trainers I've ever met, and a supremely wise in how he deals with the mindsets over there. And also on top of that, one of the most likable people you'll ever meet in your life. So he wins friends easily and has won some in very tough places. And I must admit, for the first year and a half, we were largely covert because he was not introduced as being from our center. The indigenous institution that we were partnered with over there in Islamabad introduced him as a friend from Karachi. So he was kind of in that mode for about a year and a half, and then we came out of the closet on a prospective basis. About that time, I got enough funding to be able to hire him away from AARP, which is where he was working at the time. So I told him, until all your, now these people are in very strong relationships there, so that we knew they could take it. But tell them that you've left your current work, you're now working for a faith-based NGO that really believes in this stuff, and you're living in America. So he did that, and even at that, it took him about a day to process the suspicions and all the rest of it, but it turned out well. This little caption of an American hero, we just sort of put that up there a little bit out of jest. Ozzy has done, his name is Azer Hussein, and he's just done tremendous work. He's been the point of the spear on all of this for us. And in fact, the Tannenbaum Center in New York recognized him, gave them their Peacemaker in Action Award for the year 2006. But here he's just returned, and I'm talking just within the last month, from having done a workshop in a madrasa that is known to have about 25% of its graduates go into al-Qaeda. And during the course of the discussion period, one of the attendees asked if, now where this madrasa was is one where they have done a lot of fighting in Kashmir against the Indian government. They've also opposed their own government down in Karachi just to protest the Musharraf. But the question arose, was their intervention in Kashmir sanctioned by Islam? And you can't really see him very well, but right behind Ozzy is our one of our two indigenous partners. This one happens to be a Wahhabi of some great influence, and he's thought to, just by dint of having come through the madrasas and the rest of it, as being a real scholar on Islam. And he told them, no, it is not Islamic. He says the Quran does not permit Islam to be jihad to be waged in acquiring land. Defending Islam, yes, but acquiring land, no. And this led to quite a debate in that, and there has been subsequent debate, and a consensus has emerged that the effort in Kashmir, from their point of view, is politically motivated and not religiously sanctioned. And so that's, now they're actively interacting with other madrasas in that same village. There's a number of them, about how they can sort of tone down the militant aspects of what they've been doing. So this is the getting at the ideas behind the guns, if you will. If I could have the next slide, please. The gentleman in the middle up here is the other indigenous partner we have, who is Deobandi. And what, as a result of this interaction in the mountains with the Taliban commanders, we were in a position when asked to intervene on behalf of the Korean hostages that after the second one had been killed, we were asked if we could do anything. And this gent had been the subject of a terrorist attack himself just 6 days earlier, probably because of the work he's been doing with us. Both of our indigenous partners are very strong within their radical communities, but they're very courageous and open about the fact that they're partnering with an American institution. They say if all our people have are the negative stereotypes they hear, it's going to lead to more violence and it's not good for our people. So they've been very courageous. Well, we called him into action 6 days later. He was hunkered down in his madrasa after having been attacked. And what he did is he formed an informal jirga. A jirga in Afghanistan is, it means a body of respected elders with decision-making authority. Instead of a parliament, they have a jirga, but you have jirgas at all kinds of levels. So he put together an ad hoc jirga consisting of religious leaders, both from Afghanistan and Pakistan, who were known to have a relationship with the spokesman for the Taliban captors. And they traveled in across the border to, let me have the next slide, please, to Ghazni, which is, let's see, right up about in here, it's just south of Kabul, and he himself is down here in Balochistan, which is the hot zone of Pakistan. So it was quite a trip, but he took them in there, and they sat down for a week with these spokesmen and a few of the captors, with open Qurans, and it was not without some trepidation. I mean, they felt 2 people had already been killed, but within the first hour, they said, when are you going to let the women go? And about 18 out of the 21 captives were women, so it was a not insignificant question. Did this for about a week and then left because everybody was sick as a dog from the local water, and they felt that they had done about as much as they could in terms of making their case. They extracted 3 concessions along the way. One, there would be no further harm to the hostages while these negotiations were taking place. Second, that they would release 4 to 5 women as a sign of good intent. And lastly, that they would agree to meet with the Korean delegation that had been sent over, but with whom they'd not yet had contact. So they met with the Koreans. And even though we had kept the Korean ambassador apprised every step of the way, the Korean ambassador of the United States, who's a friend, we were unable to communicate to the Korean delegation that they had agreed to let 4 to 5 go. So when they met, the Koreans asked for those who were sick, and there were only 2. So 2 were released, and 2 or 3 were left on the table, so to speak. Those negotiations broke down, and then we reassembled the nucleus of that informal jirga and added to it 3 cabinet-level figures from the previous Taliban government. One was the former Minister of Defense, another former Minister of Finance, very influential. And they went in, spent a week, and then the hostages were released. So that's kind of the story that Jim Matlock had mentioned yesterday about something that we should talk about. That, in turn, has led to an invitation from the Secretary of Religious Affairs of the Afghan government for us to bring political and religious leaders together around the common challenge of development assistance. And this is somewhat of a strategic effort. I don't know that it's going to succeed, but what you have is you have the religious communities are the lifeblood of the Taliban who are actively sabotaging all development. And so if we can somehow turn that around, this could make a huge difference. We also now, just in the last few days, have entree to be able to train the ulama from all 24 provinces of Afghanistan. And the ulama are the religious figures that sit in council, and they determine what's going to happen in that province and what's not going to happen. If they say a road's not going through, a road doesn't go through. So we're looking for the funding to be able to do that, the funding to complete the conference we're going to have of these religious and political leaders. We've already had 2 preliminary regional conferences involving about 80 people each, but the summit will be international in nature and involve about 200 people. We also have the opportunity now to reform the women's madrasas in Pakistan. At the outset, the men were apoplectic, that we were not to go anywhere near the women madrasas, but now both the women and the men are asking us to do them. One of the things we learned was that women are, if you're going to try to affect the social mores, you've got to think about the women, because we learned, one of our young ladies went over and spent a week in the different madrasas, including the Red Mosque, and talked for an hour with the Red Mosque leader who was killed later. But learned 2 things. One is that the women are much more scrupulous than the men at adhering to religious dictums of Islam, probably as a matter of survival. But they also, like many cultures, have a monopoly on the formative years of these children before they even reach the madrasas. So they're a very conservative influence and very influential in the lifeblood of the nation. So we've got that opportunity, and we also have the opportunity now to go into the Northwest Frontier Province in a big way, which we've not had before. So those are all kinds of opportunities. And let me just draw this to a close now by saying that just as setting a counterfire is often a good antidote for a blaze that's raging out of control, I submit that so too can religious reconciliation be an antidote for religious extremism. The best antidote for bad theology is good theology. This business of incorporating religion as part of the solution is not without its challenges. Not only does it require a special set of skills, but it's psychologically, physically, and emotionally draining. And it's not without its risks. More than one spiritually motivated peacemaker has paid the ultimate price. But despite the risks, and despite whatever discomfort one might feel in navigating the relatively uncharted waters of spiritual engagement, the stakes are simply too high not to give it our best shot, and only time will tell if we're up to the challenge. Thank you very much.